Um, it is now 10 o'clock, just past, so our session with the technical committee begins. I will share my little script. I hope you can all see that. So, in view of the fact that we may have a large audience today, we've muted all participants to remove background noise and to ensure that we do not talk over each other. We're also recording this session, which means what you say, your images, and the questions asked will be included in the recording. It would be sensible if you made sure you're on speaker view, which means that in speaker view, I'll be the largest picture on the screen at the moment because I'm the one speaking. So if you go to the top of your screen, the right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, you will find a little icon of either 9 little squares or 3 little squares. And if you select speaker view, that'll help your enjoyment of this session. To ask a question, if you can move down to the bottom of your screen, you'll find a toolbar, and one of the tools is a chat icon. If you click on this, it'll give you a little panel in which you can type messages. And if you type a question to everyone, we will then take questions in the order in which they appear. So I'm acting as chairman for this question session. The technical committee presenters are Tommy Day, Robin Taylor, Tony Geary and David Smith. And they're here to answer your questions on loco and coach building, track making and workshop practice. I hope you enjoy the session today. Right, I'll stop sharing now and we can go back to your questions, please. Okay, we have a question here from Steve. I'm currently well into building a David Andrews SR U class, an excellent kit, and the only real problem I've had so far has been with splasher clearances. He's using JPL wheels and 3-point suspension. Is there a view on what clearance would be satisfactory, as on the worst pair of splashers, I've effectively added a new splasher top and a thin spacer strip, which increases the size of the splasher? So who would like to answer that one? The presenters, by the way, you are currently muted, so you'll need to unmute yourselves.
Well, I'll try and answer that as best I can do. What I normally do, similar to Steve, I have like a type of three-point suspension on the main drivers. And really, it's a case of at the extreme of the rock of the wheels, it clears. And it only needs to be you know, a fraction. Or if that's a problem, just put a strip of duct tape around the inside of the splasher, and that'll form an insulation. Is that a suitable sort of answer that Steve was looking for? Anybody? I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Steve, if you'd like to unmute yourself and answer that question, or type something into the chat, please.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure if it was correct to unmute for us masses out here. Yeah, I mean, effectively that's what I'm doing. In the past, recently I built sort of BR standards and things like that, which you don't have to worry about splashes. But in the past, I've smeared a thin layer of araldite around the inside. But what concerned me was that by doing this on one of the sets of splashes, I've effectively increased the size of one set of splashes. Now you can barely tell, and I'm not too worried about it really at the moment. But if it was worse, you'd have to make them quite a bit bigger, and it would start to ruin the balance, perhaps, of the splashes versus the foot plate and everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a problem with the wheels having splashes that are slightly overscale, having flanges that are slightly overscale. Sorry.
Yeah, if I can make a comment there with the araldite, it is a very thin layer, but what I do, not necessarily with splashes, but on the insides of brake pull rods and on brake shoe faces is to smear it with araldite and then press in a single layer of tissue paper from a Kleenex. Push it all down, and then when the araldite has gone off, you can just clean it up with a knife. And that way you make sure you definitely have got an insulating layer, but it's incredibly thin.
Thank you, that's great, thank you.
One thing, as chairman, I apologise to my fellow presenters. I was supposed to ask them to introduce themselves first before the session started. And because I've never done this before, this is all new to all of us, I'd completely forgotten. So perhaps, David, since you're on screen at the moment, if you'd like to give a brief introduction to yourself.
Certainly, thank you, James. I'm David Ellow Smith. Some of you may know me on the forum as DLOS and on other forums as Isambard UK. I've been building O-gauge models since I was a young teenager. In fact, that's all the scales I've ever worked in. I've never had the traditional 00. Originally, when I was a young man, I had an idea that I'd build a garden railway, but I sort of went off that, and I've never had a railway of my own. In fact, really, I'm sort of more of a model engineer than I'm a railway modeler. I most enjoy just making things in my workshop. O-gauge rolling stock tends to be just locomotives these days. I like making tools and gadgets, and simple jigs and fixtures. Sorry, simple jigs and fixtures for mass production. And that means usually 4 or more of something. I really enjoy doing that and then making them process bits afterwards. I also do repairing of clocks and instruments and other items. In fact, people have said it's a bit like the DLOS repair shop in my workshop. Now today I'm happy to answer any workshop type questions. I don't just use machine tools, I do use hand tools. There are many other experts here on specific things who can answer the questions better than I can, but I'm actually sort of making things or using tools, very happy to have a go. Now actually, James has already mentioned there are several technical committee videos that we've made for this show. My particular contribution is machine shop practice, and I've concentrated on trying to hold the job while you're working on it. That's it really. Enjoy the session, enjoy the show.
Thank you, David. Tommy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Tommy Day, and my background is really, well, I've always been interested in railways and making model railways. It's about 40 years since I started looking at O-gauge seriously. Particularly building engines and rolling stock. And over the years, I've built many kits and a good number of scratch built items as well. It's important to me that they're all good representations of the specific prototypes and they run to a standard in line with the prototype. Though once I've completed something, it generally goes in my cupboard and just comes out occasionally to run on the local group. I have a particularly interesting Great North of Scotland area in the 50s, and many of my models are of this era, but also I was fortunate to remember steam in the 60s and the transition to diesels and electrics. So I've also made models of engines I have specific memories of. My working life was in engineering, which has always stood me in good stead with my model making. And I'm a member of the Preston O-gauge group, where there is a vast amount of experience and a lot more knowledgeable modelers than I am. I don't profess to know all the answers and I've made many mistakes over the years, but still I get much enjoyment out of my hobby. And if I can share my experiences with you, I will do, and I hope you will enjoy this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tommy. That's great. And Robin, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Robin Taylor. I used to be an N-gauge modeler some 40 odd years ago, and in the days when you couldn't buy anything British. I think there were a Minitrix Type 2 and a Pico Jubilee, and that were your lot. So I started building bodies and things on German chassis, which eventually in O-gauge led to scratch building, of course, all similar stuff. But I formed the Keighley O-gauge group when we went O-gauge in the early 70s, so that's a fair while ago, I suppose. Getting quite alarmingly close to death, I feel, because my membership number's getting to be one of the older ones, which scares you to death, I find. There's not many 4-figure ones left around now, especially the early 4 figures. Well, in Keighley, we toured, well, throughout England and Europe for many years. That's how we got to be known. mainly with Ravensbeck and Runswick Bay, the big scenic layouts. So it's scenery I'm known for. We've won enough awards around the Guild events and others as well for the scenery. We've all won awards, including Doug, who's now in New Zealand, of course. But from there, I started scratch building coaches, kit building coaches, mainly scratch building, because in the period we wanted, you couldn't buy any kits, so you had to scratch build, really, and you start off in plasticard. I couldn't solder for toffee when I joined O-Gage. We joined the guild, but we didn't go to any meetings to start with. We didn't know of any back in the early 70s. When we eventually got to somewhere that had a circular test track, ran our first prime examples of CCW around with early Pitman motors and so on, and found they all left a trail of brass filings behind them. So it was an uphill struggling. If you want to know how to do things wrong and how to put it right eventually, just ask me, because we did everything wrong. But it was a good learning curve, and O-Gage is far more satisfying. But certainly for questions, I think scenery, coach building, I have scratch built locos. If you want to know how to cheat on that, ask me. But that's perhaps be better said off screen, because some of them might upset the traders. But no, I do scratch build genuinely and make as much use of drawings when available as you can. So that's me. I'll hand to back to James so he can pass it on a little.
Thank you very much, Robin. And Tony, if you would like to introduce yourself, and don't forget to unmute. That's great.
Yeah, I'm Tony Geary. I've been building O-Gage for about 15 years. My previous background was in 4 mil for many years before that, but my interest has always been building model locos. And I've been doing that professionally for about 6 years now, after a 20-year career in IT and finance. I'm fortunate enough now to have space for my own layout. So over the lockdown, I've been building that and laying track. I've got a background in track making. In my 4 mil days, I made the track for Charlton and Stoke Summit, which was sort of well known on the exhibition circuit. Following the moving on from those, I got involved with Hayside, which has done a couple of shows, and all my work was under the layout because my background is electronics and technology. So all my efforts on Hayside were underneath, not seen by many people. So my layout that I'm building at the moment is it was designed using Templot with assistance of other people. It's based on a place called Basford North, just outside Nottingham. It's in a 30-foot room, which is a bit squeezed in. The track's made mostly using C&L components, with some copper-clad stuff. There's 40 turnouts altogether, half of those of which I'm making. And it's very much work in progress at the moment. About 75% of the track is laid. And I've done some track making videos that are available to see on our website. And that's enough, I think, for the moment.
Thank you very much, Tony. That's great. Okay, visitors. Right, I have a question here from Giles Brown. Could Tony share some tips as to how he achieves such neat soldering that you can see in pictures on RM Web?
I can. I'll just step away and get something to point at the camera. So this is a J6 which I've been working on. Now, how do I get neat soldering? Well, I use an Ursa Icon 1 soldering iron. It's on the other side of the room, but you can Google that. They're quite expensive. They're about 270 quid, I think, when I bought them. It's temperature controlled, heats up in 6 seconds. My old Antex iron packed up, and I thought, shall I go for the expense of having this particular iron? And it's been well worth it. I wouldn't be without it. It's light to use, got substantial amount of heat in the tip, even though it's a very light handpiece. So you can get a lot of heat into the model. Now the flux I use, I suppose all the basic things about soldering is cleanliness, heat, and flux. So the first thing to do is make sure your brass is clean. And I've come across various kits that looks like that I've been asked to build that look like they've been stored in the garden shed. They all have to be cleaned. You have to have very clean brass. Traditionally, people always use for phosphoric acid for soldering. I did that for a few years. I find it fairly noxious, really. So I tend to use one that's a citrus-based flux from building 7mm gauge online, 7mm models online. And it's a citrus-based flux. It's much less toxic than the phosphoric acid. It cleans up nicely. It doesn't leave a residue. One of the things I do when I am soldering is during a session, I'll wash the model after every phase of assembly. So for instance, say soldering the cab onto this J6, maybe just soldering the inside of the cab, I would then take it and wash it so that the flux doesn't get dragged everywhere onto your tools, so that the model stays clean. The other secret is, of course, if you're using enough heat and you get that brass nice and hot, I generally use 145 solder with a good amount of heat. That solder will flow nicely. Some good flux there, that'll flow nicely around. And the other secret is not to use too much solder, because the more you use, the more you've got to clean off. So you only use tiny, incy little bits of solder. If you haven't used enough, it won't stick on. So you don't need big fillets everywhere. So I don't know if you can see this, the beading around the edge there, on the front edge of the cab there, that's soldered on from the outside. Well, I just fed a little bit of solder around with the flux. And you can always put flux on the other side of something to draw the solder through, if you want. As to cleaning up, I'll just pop over the other side of the room. And I have a special tool, which I can't find, but it looks like this, really. This is a ground down, broken file that was ground down. So I use scrapers to clean up the brass to give it that, and that cleans all your excess solder off. Once that's done, then to polish up your brass, you can use these emery sticks. I got these from the Model Car Company, I think it is, but quite a few of the tool places do these. And they come in various grades, from a 600, 400 grit, to something like 100, which is quite coarse, really. But that'll get rid of the worst of the solder. Once you've used those, you get a nice clean finish on the cab. There's bits you can't get into with those. You can scrub away as much as you like. You won't get into some of those corners. So the other secret weapon is over here as well. And that is a rather battered steel polishing brush that I use in my, well, it's not a Dremel, but it's a mini drill. And that'll go around, that'll polish up the brass nicely, get into the corners, and it'll give you a nice clean finish. So just to recap, really, it's a good soldering with plenty of reserves of heat. If your solder's going lumpy as you're trying to put it on, you ain't got enough heat in it. So you want a good amount of heat to get that solder to flow. And you'll see once you'll see it run through nicely. The other thing to when you're putting your soldering on is you can watch. You get to learn to watch closely what's happening, and you see that solder flow. And if you're soldering next to some other things, and you think, oh, I don't want those to come off, you get your solder iron on there. Watch it closely to see the heat move and the solder flow. Once it's there, take the iron off, and it'll set nicely. The other thing is, don't move whatever you've sold. Don't jog what you've soldered on sometimes. If it's a chunky casting, it will retain the heat. So you get it nicely soldered on, the solder will flow all underneath it. You'll think, lovely. Pull the iron away, knock it, it moves out of line and then goes solid. So you just have to watch that sometimes with some of the bigger castings. So heat, flux, decent solder. I use a mixture. I use anything from 70 to, I use 7 different solders, but mostly 145 for general construction, 70 degree for white metal. Although I do solder white metal with 145 solder, you've got to be quite brave to do that. But well, again, you watch the heat flow and the solder flow. So I do solder white metal castings onto brass with 145. You can use 100. I use that as well. And that's sometimes quite useful filling as well. If you've got some little gaps or something you want to fill, I use 100 degree solder. I've also got 188, which I use for coupling rods. And I've got a 210, which I hardly ever use. And then several grades of 60-40. There's a thin grade and a thick grade. And they're just sometimes for large assemblies like frames, I might use 60-40. but still use flux, even though it's core fluxed. I still use traditional flux. Sorry, not traditional flux. My citrus-based fluxed. Right. So yeah. So that was heat, cleanliness. The cleanliness is, but if it's clean, then that's really important. Going in with a tarnished bit of brass is not. It's just not going to work because the flux won't cut through that. So you've got to have it clean in the first place. So hopefully that gives you some idea.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Can people hear me? Okay.
Yes. Perfect.
Just one further question, if I may, which is, in terms of the soldering iron, do you stick with a single tip for all of the work you do, or do you swap the tips around? I know that's not easy to do when you're modelling, but if so, what size tip do you traditionally use? Do you use the sort of screwdriver tip, or the more pointed one, or what do you find best?
On an Ursa, it unscrews and comes out in seconds. So this is a rather battered, but it's a 4 mil chisel edge, and that's pretty well. I use that all the time, even for small stuff, because again, it's got a lot of heat reserve, even though it doesn't look it, because it's a lot smaller than Antex, but it's got a lot of heat reserve in that. And so if you're soldering onto a big piece of brass, it's all there. It'll do it. And as to changing bits, yeah, I mean, I unscrewed that in a second. The great thing about the Antex, the Ursa Icon 1, I'm not a salesman for it, but it heats up in 6 seconds. So it's great. And when you're not using it, it's got a motion sensor, so it cools off. So it doesn't sit there burning away all day. It'll go down to whatever temperature you want it to, 200 degrees or whatever. Pick it up, 6 seconds. By the time you've got it to the work, it's to temperature. So it's a fantastic tool. I wouldn't be without it. I do use a smaller bit, but that's mostly for electronic stuff. I pretty well just use this one for everything. Yeah.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tony. That's terrific.
One thing I forgot is with the Ursa Icon 1, I change the temperatures, of course. So if you're using different solders, you can crank the temperature up. So with 70 degree solder, for instance, you might have the iron at 120 degrees, something like that. If I'm soldering a white metal item with 145, I'll probably put it at about, I don't know, 180 degrees. It's risky, but it works. Yes, there we are.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have another question, which I've directed at the moment to Tommy. I will read it out. Hi, I'm working on my first Loco build, 040 starter kit from Connoisseur Models, and it runs okay without the body on, but with the weight of the body, it always binds in reverse at the same point. The coupling rods slide forward and backward fairly freely, but not a lot of sideways movement. Any tips on how to diagnose and resolve the issue? Unsure if it's motor, worm, gear, or couplings. And that's from James. I don't have a surname.
From Jason.
James. Another James. Same as me.
James. Yeah. Right. Good morning, James. These are the sort of things where it would be ideal to actually look at the to look at the problem, but from what you say, it runs without the motor on. It runs without the body on. It runs fairly satisfactorily in forward and reverse. But as soon as you put the body on, it starts binding at the same position every time in reverse.
Yeah.
That's what I see as your question. I would suggest really that there may be something actually catching on the wheels. If you're using Slater's wheels, the first thing I would do is have a look at the back of the wheels and make sure that you haven't left a moulding pip on the plastic, which is possibly catching on somewhere on the chassis. The other thing, if you've got a lot of sideways play on the wheels, it may be worthwhile you trying to shim to reduce that. With an 040, you don't need only minimum side play. If you've got a lot of side play, when you put it in reverse, the motor might be pushing the axle to one side, which could be catching on the splashers, which was a similar problem to what Steve had earlier on. But really, it sounds like it's a mechanical snag that's catching with it just running in one direction. So that's what I would do. I'd just have a really close look and see if there is something just contacting that's stopping it going. As I say, really, that sort of problem is easier to look at and resolve by looking at it, but that's what I would do. Are you all right with that, James?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So when you say try and take out side play in the wheels, you put like a washer in or something to try and stop them moving?
Yeah, yeah, a washer or a shim. Slaters do a whole different series of shim washers. I think they do 10 thou, 15, 20 thou, various sizes, or maybe if there's an excessive clearance, just a 5mm steel washers. But try and put them on both sides to balance the restriction to both sides of the chassis.
Okay, thanks. And when you put in the motor and the worm and so on, do you tighten them all the way tight to the mount and so on, or do you try and leave a bit of flex in there?
I was always advised to not tie them down too tight, because is it a self-contained like motor and gearbox?
No, it's a worm and scrub screws, I think.
Right. I would leave just a little bit of play. If you tighten it down too tight, it can distort things. But it needs to be nipped down. For many years, I've used motors and gearboxes, which more or less create the alignment automatically. With a separate motor and gearbox, and separate motor and worm, you do have to be just a little bit careful to make sure that your meshing is adjusted correctly.
Super. And if you were to like file the coupling rod slightly oval, can you go too far, or should there be a little bit of like side to side movement on it?
If there is with Connor circuits, generally they're very accurate. So you should the frames and the chassis are very accurate. You shouldn't really have more than a few thou of clearance if it's a rigid chassis.
Yeah.
The trouble is, the more clearance you create between the crank pin and the coupling rod, the more your wheels can end up binding. The more play there is between the wheels, which is something you don't really want.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, lovely. No, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tommy, for that. Are there any other questions, please? If there aren't at the moment, then David L.O. Smith can talk about some of his models that he's been making. David, would you like to do that?
Yes, thank you, James. Actually, perhaps the thing to do first, if you could share screen for me so that I can show. Tony was talking about, and I've forgotten who asked the question now, about soldering iron bits and soldering irons. I've got a soldering iron just like Tony's, but I still have my old 40-watt Weller, and I use it quite a bit. One of the things, can I share screen? Can I try?
Sorry, I've
It's
just
still disabled. So-
yeah. Apologies. I've just taken off the wrong co-host. I made you co-host, then immediately took you off. Right.
right, there we go. Right, Tony was talking about soldering iron bits, and I have got a whole armoury of bits. I don't feel that soldering iron bits are precious at all. I just make them and bend them into all sorts of shapes. Now, traditionally, of course, we tend to use the sort of, let's call it the soldering iron bit, but there's also little pointy bits which are useful. But one of my two favourites is what I call the hatchet-shaped bit. And these are marvellous fitting inside, say, tender tanks or bunkers where you can't get the iron in. Now, some of the others are sort of very sort of specialist ones. This one isn't a soldering iron bit at all, actually. I use that for joining rubber belts. But anyway, I just thought I'd say, with the temperature controlled irons, obviously you don't want to go messing about with those very special bits. But I just make bits that go over the top. So I don't think this one does, but I just make a hole up there and then you can go over the top to reach little places. Okay. Let me just go back to what I was supposed to be doing. Oh gosh, hang on, bear with me a minute. Sorry about that, I did have it ready. Let's try again, yes. Right, if there aren't any other questions, one of the things that I was known for doing, and I haven't done much of it recently, is taking a sort of a standard ready-to-run model and then completely dismantling it. As my wife once said, good value for money, are they? Are they, these ready-to-run kits? And it's a fair point. But the thing about a ready-to-run kit is it got most of the bits, and it was running before you started, so it really should be running when you finished. Just very quickly, I'll go through this. If perhaps some of you haven't seen this, it was on the forum a couple of years ago. This is a fine-scale brass or Sancheng Models Great Western 060 saddle tank, and it starts off like this. Well, there are a number of things that I did with it, and one of the things I noticed was the smoke box door is completely wrong. Now, there are castings, and I did look at that, but I thought, well, what's the fun in buying a casting? Why don't I try and make one? Now, let me just move this out of the way for myself. Right, yeah, the smoke box door's got a sort of a double reverse curve, and as you can see, this is a more typical single curve. So, right, this is what we do. I wanted to press one. So I made a little setup, and I mentioned at the beginning, I just love making little jigs to make things. Now in this case, I was only making one, but if I ever need to make any more, I've got it. Here's the wooden sort of die. There's a former that goes on top to restrain the piece of 10 thou shin stop, which is going to go in the middle. So then a wooden punch, put the whole lot together and press it in. Now I actually pressed this in on my drill press, but you could do it in a vise or even with a big hammer, I suppose. And my first attempt wasn't brilliant. Not bad for first attempt. 15 thou brass, actually far too thick. I did one in 10 thou, and it was far better. I'll show you in a minute. Well, that's the dome. Sorry, that's the door itself. But there's also a ring round the door, and here's where one of the questions comes up. So how do you get hold of it? There's the wooden block again. Screw on a piece of brass, and quite simply machine out the bits you don't want, and you finish up with a ring which you can solder onto the door. So that was the door. Put it on the model. I think it looks rather better. And here we have the before and the after. An improvement, I think. And it was great fun doing it. I mean, that's the thing. For me, it's mostly about the journey rather than the arrival. Like Tommy, when my models are finished, they finish up on the shelf behind me. And unless they get invited to have some running powers, they never go anywhere. The balance weights needed a bit of working on. Here, you can see I've machined out the old balance weight because really it should be sticking up proud of the wheel rather than flush with the rim. I've tried making balance weights, if you like, by hand, sorting out a disc and then sort of cutting it, but it's never been brilliant. I've always thought there must be a better way. So in this case, I took the disc, cut it into 3. I know I need 4, but hey, gonna have to do it twice. Set it up in a piece of wood again, held the thing down. So this is a bit more of a problem. How do you hold the job? And then just mill away the bits you don't want. There it is in closer detail. And you finish up with a nice little balance weight, which fits in the wheel like that. So here we are on home ground now. Fit one of my sort of standard crank pins with its top hat washers and securing nut, and on we go. Now, one of the things that cropped up on one of the forums, I'm not sure it was the Gauge Guild forum, it might have been RM Web. The modeler was originally supplied with rather undernourished cylinders. It's very obvious to me. So I thought, well, we could do something better than that. And I just made some larger ones. I was able to reuse the wrapper. And this cylinder here is actually machined, if you can imagine it, like a spool. So it's 2 discs and then a thin bit in the middle. And by doing this, it makes it very easy to solder the wrapper back on. If it had been a solid cylinder, it would have needed a fair amount of heat. Another thing was the motion bracket, motion plate was, I don't know what it was, but that's what it looked like. I've got an engineer's notebook and I've drawn my sketches. They're not to scale, they're just dimension sketches. And then make something in plastic because it's much easier, check that it fits, modify the design a bit and finish up with something like that. Again, I probably could have bought something like that, but I really enjoyed doing it. And there's the sort of the end result. There's the motion bracket and there's the cylinder end with the stuffing box reused. Before and after, an improvement, I think. I got some cylinder drain cuts actually from Warren Shepherd. I could have made those, but that's an awful lot of work and I've done it before. So the other thing that I did was looked at the chassis, and actually on most of fine scale brass, certainly the early ones, it was the below the footplate which let it down. And so I did a little bit of work on that. Take the motor out and make it into a separate unit so I can spring all 3 axles. I always put sort of an enclosure around the gearbox. Originally, although I never had a garden railway of my own, I had a friend who had a marvellous garden railway. If you run your models outside in the garden, it's amazing what they can pick up. So I've always put a sort of a sump underneath. So I did that. And I also turned the frames round because originally the flanges were on the outside. You just go back up here, you can see they're facing outwards, which is a peculiar thing to do. Turn them round, obviously swap them over as well, left to right, and off we go. Now you can put the frames at a much more reasonable distance, so there's a nice small space between the wheels and the frame. Brakes, interestingly, although it's a 6-coupled engine, it's only got brakes on 2 axles. And I try as best I can to make the brake assembly removable. You can see there's little sort of pins here, and I get those to sort of usually fit into the, snap into the frame. In this case, it does actually screw on, and it's fitted in there. There's all sorts of other bits that's nice to add, like the cross shaft and proper, I'm going to call it now, anyways, goes to the handbrake. Whistles, or I can always do better with whistles. Put in a little flange around here.
Make yourself comfortable, why don't you?
You're right. I find that the fine scale brass vacuum pipes and the steam pipes are rather poor, but they can be reused. And the same with the draw hooks. I don't know where Randolph got his idea of the draw hooks from, but they're all the same and they're all hopelessly wrong. So I make another draw hook, but I can reuse the links. New reversing rod, and then quickly spray it and put it all back together again. That's what you finish up with. So, I hope that was entertaining. Anything anybody'd like to say?
I do have another question that's popped up on the chat, David, and that was what do you make the soldering iron bits from?
Oh, the soldering iron bits. Let's just go back here. Have they come up on the screen now? The soldering iron bits, I just make them out of 1/4-inch copper usually.
Right. Okay. So just a pure copper rod.
Yep. The thing is, of course, you can buy supplies when you go to model exhibitions, but I also go to model engineering exhibitions, and bits of copper rod are almost lying on the floor, and they just sort of
just pick them up.
Usually 50 pence for a quid, you can pick up a piece of 1/4-inch or 6mm copper bar for not a lot.
That's great. Okay, lovely.
Shall I stop sharing? Yep.
Yeah, do you want to stop screen sharing now then,
Yep,
David?
yep. Done that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very informative. Right, Tommy. I'm going to make Tommy a co-host again, and right, Tommy, you are a co-host again. If you would like to talk about your workshop. Can't hear you at the moment, Tommy. I think you're still muted.
Sorry, I'm looking for screen share.
Should be down the bottom of your screen, I hope.
Nope, I don't see anything.
Okay, let me just double check. You are a co-host, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you found it? Shall I withdraw co-host and give it to you again, just in case?
Try
Okay.
moving your mouse about, Tommy, because sometimes the part of the menu disappears.
Where is
Yeah,
it?
I find I have to move the mouse down to the bottom of the screen to show it.
Let's try that one again, Tommy.
Screen share, got it. Yep, okay.
Excellent.
Right. Right. What I've got here is just some information on my workshop. If I can, it's a bit of a clutter. I do apologise for that, but I've got. I don't know if you can. I can't see what you can see now, but we've got a picture of my workbench.
Yep.
Okay. Well, for many years, I used to just carry my toolbox and my wooden base into the living room and worked on my workbench in the living room when we had a family and we needed the garage. And up to about maybe 15 years ago, all my models were built literally on the kitchen table. But once we had more space, I eventually ended up in the garage. So I've now got in effect to my workbench, and this is where most things go on. In the middle, you can see the Duchess, which I've made a couple of videos for this show, which show how the chassis goes together and various bits on the chassis. But basically, it's about 4 foot long. As you can see, I've got my Entex soldering iron. I don't run to one of the expensive ones. A couple of vices, toolbox, other clutter, Swiss files, tweezers, a cheapo, I think it was Aldi power drill, and a mini drill. This is my little guillotine cum bender, which I got from Chester Tools, which over the years I've found absolutely invaluable for chopping sheet metal, sheet brass. This particular vise is, I had the serrations ground off many years ago, so it doesn't damage anything. It's now a smooth surface, and a little old clockmaker's vise. I don't know what else you can see from that one, but on the back of my garage, I've got a pillar drill which I got from B&Q many years ago, and an ancient Myford ML3 lathe, which I've often toyed with the idea of I'd like a modern lathe, but that does everything I need. So I haven't needed to replace it. A bench grinder, another vise. On the top, running up on the top, I've just got a test track. It's about 12 foot long. It's got a Pico point on it, just for checking roughly the 6 foot curves. If I just flip back, loads and loads of stuff. I'm sorry it's such a clutter, but yeah, it needs a good tidy up. my third bench is I've got, it's not very clear, but I've got a little milling cum boring machine, which I got from Chester Tools many years ago. I was a jig borer. I served my apprenticeship as a jig borer, and which probably most of you won't know what a jig borer is, but it's precision boring holes and drilling. This, it wasn't expensive. I think it was about 400, 500 pounds, but it's accurate. I can work it to within a thou or 0.025 of a millimeter. It's a lovely little tool, and I get a lot of pleasure out of using it. Heavy duty vise, my magnifying goggles, and various other stuff that I got with the Miller cum borer. And really that's my workshop. It's heated, it's comfortable. I have a little hi-fi set in there, so when I'm working I can listen to music and or whatever I feel is necessary. What I don't have is a little serving hatch into the house, so when I need a cup of tea, I can't get my wife to pass one through the wall. I have to go out and into the house. That was one I got a no with. So that's my workshop, and it needs to be comfortable. If you, whatever you're doing, you need to be comfortable while you do it. And yeah, so there you go.
Thank you for that, Tommy. And don't worry about your workshop being untidy. I can't imagine anybody else has got a tidy one at all.
Right. I need to.
Mine is much the same. Robin, would you like to talk about something? I'm going to take Tommy's co-host away and give that to you, Robin, if you'd like to talk about something. Right, there you go. That's you done. Do you want to unmute yourself, Robin? Robin, you'll need to unmute yourself, mate. We can't hear you at the moment.
There we are.
That's better.
Yeah. The workshops are fascinating because they're all so similar. They're all a pigsty. I live in a 3-bedroom semi, as I'm sure many do nowadays. I've got the box room, the sort of 10x6 room, as what I'd call a workshop. It isn't strictly the entire workshop, though, because up in the attic I've got the lathe permanently mounted up there because they're awkward to carry about, even if they're on a plug top. And I've got a spray booth next to it with an extract, just a standard Expellair bathroom extract with a bit of ductwork you get. The hard bit's making a hole through the exterior wall, of course, and that just pulls the fumes out as you spray, particularly if you do quite basic modelling like me, as I call it, with the rattle cans, because the cellulose sprays normally, and some of the etch primers can be quite nasty as well. So you do need an extract if you're doing a lot of spraying. If I'm doing a tiny little job, I don't bother turning the extract on, I'll be honest, because the attic's big enough anyway to dissipate the fumes. I've just got a fan heater up there for when I am using the spray booth, because you don't want the mottled effect you can get if you're spraying in too cold an atmosphere, or indeed if your model's too cold, which I'm sure we've got people who are far greater experts at spraying than me. The worst thing any of you can do, a bit of advice, with your workshop is decorate it. I decorated mine around May, and can I find anything since then? You're better off with the biggest pigsty in the world because you know where everything is. So anyway, I think that covers my workshops. I think generally speaking, you all had similar to me. Mine scattered around a bit more. But on the screen at the moment, you can see a sort of what I'd call a standard coach chassis. This one's slightly unusual for me in that it's got some battery boxes in the middle. And I don't usually model modern stock like that, but this was a Caledonian coach. So it's dual fitted. You can see the Westinghouse in the middle of the chassis there and the vacuum off to the one side next to the dynamo, because the Caledonian seemed fairly forward thinking for the period and had electric lighting, whereas others were still using gas. And I have heard of some companies that bought coaches where they fitted electric, but particularly around London when it was all start-stop services, the dynamos couldn't keep up, so they retrofitted with gas because it was actually more reliable, which I can understand. Anyway, that's a standard sort of basic chassis, mainly made from scrap. You can see, if I go into the middle, click on that, the middle area. The base of that, I've used anything because you just want a little bit of metal to solder all your bits of junk on, your vacuum, braking, gas cylinders or electric cylinders. So they're all there, and I just use scrap nickel silver etch in strips across because it's free and I have it. I have in the past used a complete sheet of just tin plate because you spray it, no one's going to see it. You just want something metallic to hang things off. I've got, well, actually, it's Dingham Couplers up in Skipton. He gets miles and miles of strip nickel silver from his etches before he packages them up for sale. And that's it all just cut into short lengths to fill in the middle of a coach. And again, it's scrap brass for the running boards on either side and metal strip for the sole bars. The sole bars, I used to use channel. You've no need to use channel. It is slightly more expensive. And being a Yorkshireman, we're also looking at price. So I just use strip now, and I make it into a T-section by soldering a footboard along it, as you would get on any coach. I'll show you. I'll pass one down in a minute from the shelf so you can see a bit better. And then bogies can be either etched with white metal bits you stick on, or these are all white metal where I just get sides and ends, and you have to fill the middle in with some brass. It depends what make you buy. And we do cast a lot ourselves over the years. I mean, Dougie, who you may have seen earlier from New Zealand, he ran Roundfield Engineering before he emigrated. So obviously he made some Fox bogies for us that cast, but they were just sides. This has got Slater's wheels, the usual garbage on each end. Just strip again. I get my buffers from wherever you can get them, depending on the prototype. But I model Great North of Scotland down to LSWR. Great North of Scotland will be the next ones on the bench, actually. I don't do it professionally. I've just got an interest in colourful coaches. But I get most of the buffers from Haywood. He does a tremendous range. The fully sprung, white metal castings with steel heads, a little bit like the Slaters, but they come ready-made, so you've only got to do some cleaning up with a white metal casting, and then solder.
You've gone back on mute. I don't know what you've done, Robin. Robin, you're back on mute. Sorry about this, everybody. Robin's obviously pressed a button on his screen somewhere, and he's dropped it. While he's trying to sort himself out, Robin, can you hear me? You're back on mute. Oh dear. Unfortunately, I'm not able to unmute him at the moment.
Can you put a message up on the screen?
Yes, what I'll have to do is I will withdraw his, and I will options, participant sharing, that's it.
Right, I can unmute now. I've got the big screen. You can't unmute on my computer while you're sharing a screen.
Really, that's very peculiar. I don't know
Yeah,
what that is.
all the symbols we see at the bottom, the chat, share screen, etc.,
What-
lose everything except share screen when I
Okay.
share screen.
You can usually hover over your picture and you'll get a mute or unmute button.
Yeah, but that doesn't work actually on the mouse. I had that and it doesn't work for some
Oh,
reason.
really? Very
Yeah.
strange. We have a question while you were talking, Robin, about having a spray booth. From James, could someone give me the process they follow for painting brass models and any tips or tricks for a novice, particularly without needing an airbrush?
Yeah, no problem. I use either rattle cans or I've got a nice airbrush anyway. I've forgotten what make it is, to be honest, but it is from a local professional company that do spray things, including very small things with like models. So I bought one off them, but there's many makes around. I started off, I'll be honest, with a cheap Humbrol one and got used to spraying with that first. And if you're going to go into spraying, don't spend a fortune on an airbrush, get the cheapest one you can find till you've got used to doing it. And then you can, once you're happy with it, you can buy a more expensive airbrush, £100-200 quite easily spent on an airbrush. But you've got to be sort of used to using one to start with. If you're going to spray for reasonable periods, and I'm talking, 10-15 minutes or more, you really, if you're going to do it indoors, you want an extract. And I just went down to B&Q or the local DIY. You get a 4-inch extract fan for your bathroom or kitchen. You can get ductwork with that, the flexible plastic ductwork. And you can get all the cooker hoods have normally a white washable air filter you can take out and wash periodically to get the grease off it. If you fry a lot of chips, I don't, sadly, with a diet. So I don't think any of us do now. We're all more aware of diets. So you can get that material, again, from a DIY shop quite easily where you buy your extract hoods anyway. And you get a whole sheet of it. You can make about 10 filters out of that.
How do you prepare the model, first of all? What would you use?
Certainly. The first thing I use, I find when soldering, people talk about solders and fluxes and things, and it's great. I do talk about that myself. But as I think David said earlier, wash your model every day or after every modelling session. After you've done any work on it, don't leave flux on it. So you're getting rid of the thing that can create green algae and eat into your metal. So that's the start, which is an ongoing process as you're building whatever. After that, when I actually prepare it for working on, I actually wash it with Jif. Now, I put the plug in the sink. That's the most important thing, because the ideal thing with washing with Jif is any bits that aren't soldered on very well or glued on very well are going to drop off, and you don't want them down the plug hole, because you've some of these white metal and brass castings can cost you a fortune. So give it a good scrub. I use a toothbrush and a little Jif along the sides and things. Anything where I've not got into the corner with some flux or something, I use a fiberglass pen. And certainly I've got, with a large side tank engine, the North Eastern Railway had a lot of them. If it's a large flat area where you're going to grip it with your thumbs, and as we know, some of our locals can be quite heavy to pull things, you want a good grip of your paint. So I've got a fine brass wire brush, and you can get them for cleaning your hush puppies, for instance, from the shoe shops. It's just like a large toothbrush. You wouldn't like to use it on your teeth, though, but destroy your gums. Give any large side sheets a rough up with that. It's not going to bother the paint work. The scratches won't show. It's just a little bit heavier than using a fiberglass brush throughout. But you do need the fiberglass brush for getting into the corners and things, just to create that slightly rough surface. Don't wash them in washing up liquid, I find. It's usually got lanolin in, which of course is an oily effect, whereas the Jif or similar, I find is more of an abrasive. I don't think you can get Vim anymore, the powdered Vim that we all remember from our youths. I used to use that, but I've not seen it on the shelves for a long time. Perhaps too many people have been using it for baking or something. I don't know, with the lack of flour early this year. So that's it then. Spray them. The the easiest thing if you're beginning with, use a rattle can for priming. It's as good as anything for the average modeler. Most of us aren't professional modelers. We're not going to sell them on. So I drift across. If you start from left to right or right to left, it doesn't matter which, but start spraying before your spray gun gets near your model, or your can gets near your model. So you switch it on, you're spraying, you pass it across the model, stop spraying. Go back the other way, so you start spraying, pass it across the model again. When you've passed the model, switch it off. Now, the ideal thing is keep it about a foot away at least. I mean, your spray booths aren't very large normally, so a foot away is quite a reasonable foot, 18 inches, about as much as you're going to get. The extract's working anyway, so you're all right. I do wear a mask, but to be honest, I've not to say that because we all wear them anyway nowadays for other reasons. But if you're spraying and you pass across and you've covered the metal with paint on the first pass, you're spraying too heavily. You want to let that dry just for a minute and then pass across again and again and again, but let it dry between each coat, because if you're spraying too heavily and you cover it with paint in the first coat, you can get the chance that the paint could run, or it could be just on too thick and you lose some of your detail, of course. So the ideal is to pass it across, even a rattle can, and you'll still see the brass through a light grey or oxide primer coat. And then let that go off for a minute in a reasonably warm area. No problem in summer, of course, with heat. And then pass it across again. So I find that works. So you're building up your layers of paint rather than risking anything running. Does that about cover it?
Yeah,
that's super. Thank you. Is there any techniques for using a brush then once you've primed? If you wanted to brush the top coat, for example.
Yeah, the top coat, I tend to find once it's all sprayed and we're happy, I thin the paint a little more. So you get a very fine, some people actually spray more or less with just thinners, but I don't like the idea of that. And I leave it 3 or 4 days before I put transfers or anything on. I mean, I do ball pen line most models. I think I'm a complete amateur, but people say that's wonderful and this, that, and the other, but you tend to run down your own work. I'm what I'd call an average modeler. So I do use a lot of ball pen, and I make various templates to go around splashes, and I've just got a single to do in the next week, a single driver. So I'll make a template out of a plastic card. As David said, plastic card's cheap and easy to work with. Make a curved template out of that to fit around the splash, and I'll run my ball pen around that. So that's that. I do use the transfers, the HMRS. You've got to use them for the thirds, firsts, and the loco crests and things like that anyway. You get them wherever you can. A lot of people prefer the water slide, but I tend to find, particularly in pre-group, you've got to go with whatever you can get, because nobody does all the stuff for pre-group. And very often, if you're stuck, I'll use Letraset or a crest that's similar. Ignore the colours, particularly with Letraset, because you can put that on and use it as a template to go over with a fine brush in the colour that you do want. And I find I use Humber Oil as the bulk. We have to use the Precision and so on anyway, because they do a better range of specialist colours. They all require thinning, and I thin them very slightly if I'm going to go across a crest, a similar crest, to change it into a different crest, or I'll use black Letraset and paint it, say, red or gold shaded blue or something like that for some obscure company.
Quick question from Alan, Robin. How long do you let each sparse coat dry before the next pass?
Oh, just seconds, 20 seconds. It really depends how warm your spray area is. I mean, I use the attic. It's warm enough in summer without any heat on. In winter, I've got a fan heater with a built-in thermostat, which I just sit on the floor somewhere behind me. I warm it up before I go up and spray, leave it on half an hour or so everything gets nice and warm. I carry the model up normally at the last minute, then it's warm from the workshop or the house anyway. And so don't spray onto a cold model. You'll get an eggshell effect. So make sure your model's reasonably warm. I've heard of people putting models in ovens and things, but that quite alarms me, so I wouldn't recommend that. And I certainly wouldn't recommend microwaving your model, even if it is plastic. But it's surprising what you hear when you're sat down demonstrating or on the technical stand, and the various things people have tried. But there again, I've done it all wrong, so don't be bothered if you make a mistake. Don't let it deter you. Keep at it.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Robin. Well, we are at the end of our hour for the technical session, and we have no further questions. I would like to thank all our presenters very much for their work today, and thank you all, everybody who has joined us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the virtual show. And it's goodbye from all of us. Goodbye.